My presents 2 times this month with we're off to a great start. See, getting back into the swing of this thing. I'm very thankful we have a work day tomorrow, because otherwise I'd probably be in trouble if I had to go back to full-fledged teach tomorrow. So I am excited to be with you this morning and to be teaching with you. I always think it's really, don't want to say crazy, but I do think it's like when people don't understand like how much God moves in our lives. When I was doing my Bible study and then when I went to do my devotion, like how much they correlate, like, and they're 2 separate entities completely, but how much they overlap and how much they coincide. And I think in our lives, there's so many times where God just does that little presence in our lives that we don't realize, like, oh, he is there. Like, this is my reminder to show you that I am with you. And so I thought that was like really just kind of a good feel, like as I was finishing up studying this, and then right before my Bible study last night, like before I went to bed, it was just a good like kind of summary and reflection of like, we're going to be good tomorrow, and a reminder like, hey, it needs to stay in the forefront of your brain as we start in the new year. So I thought that this was actually a really good lesson to kind of be our intro into the thing. And we're in session 5 in our books. And so basically it's about treasure and how Jesus changes our priorities in life. And so when we accept Jesus into our heart, a lot of our priorities change. And so really, when we think about what our priorities are, they reveal to us what is important. And when people see the things that are our priorities, like they know that's what we put value in. And so a lot of times what our priorities are also what we choose to invest our money in, because that's what our priorities are. And so I think it's very important that when we look at what our priorities are in life, or what we treasure the most in life, we have to consider how does that align with what God has laid out for us and what God values for us. Because the Bible tells us all the things that we should be to be godly, and he tells us that he's going to be with us. And I think it's very important, like as we do our Bible study today, that he doesn't ever tell us in the Bible, like you're never going to have to really, or you're never going to have a moment where you don't worry. He tells us not to worry, and he says it 100 times in the Bible not to worry. But I think he knew that no matter how many times he tells us not to worry, we're going to still have to worry. And that's why he had to tell us, and that's why Jesus had to tell us, and that's why the disciples had to tell us, like, because in the end, no matter what, we're going to still have anxiety and stress that naturally results because of the life that we live. But I think it's very important that when we're looking at that, and we're looking at our priorities, and we're looking at what we treasure the most, we have to be mindful that we are disciples of Christ, and because of that, we are not limited to overcoming worry because of our relationship with God. We know that worry will have, but the more time that we spend in the Word, and the more time that we invest in understanding what God has laid out before us, the more time that we spend in Bible study and prayer, they provide that foundational treasure to then impact the other things that we treasure in our lives. And so I think that was one of the really nice things about what we're going to talk about today in our study. And so I think it's important to think that about like, what are common debts that people have, like in general, that we see in life? I think one simple is a mortgage. Most people have a house. Yes, car payments, student loans, credit cards. I mean, I think that's a really big one for some people. I feel like a lot of times younger people, like that's one thing that somebody didn't train them, and they got that first one. They were super excited, and they said, ooh, free money. And then they realized it's not really free money. And I think a lot of times, like, those are common household debts that we see among people. Like, I think no matter what life you live in, and unless you're 100% like Dave Ramsey and a multi-millionaire and all the things, like you, and some people are, like, they live completely debt-free. And to me, that is amazing. Glad you can live your life that way. But I think, you know, like we said, people have mortgages and car payments and all the things. And so I think that is something that we're mindful of, that debt is like money that we owe someone or something. And you have good debt and you have bad debt, and money experts will talk about all the good debt and the bad debt. And, sometimes those things are there. However, if you can't pay your debt, then you have issues, right? Somebody's coming to find you, and then you feel like you're drowning and you can't catch up because you just get further and further behind. And I think a lot of times that bad debt is when people have misplaced priorities, like they treasured something or they keep investing in things and they're not necessarily 100% like focused on what they want to, but sometimes God reminds us that even in those moments, no worries, like I'm going to take care of you. I think a lot of times we get stressed a lot of times about finances in life because not necessarily we want to say that's something that we treasure, but we just know that finances are something that is a big portion of our lives. And I think it's kind of important to be mindful that, what we consider drowning may be nothing to somebody else, and what they consider drowning may be nothing to us. And because I think about, like, even if you have all the money in the world and you have poverty, your stress and worries are completely different. And I think it's the same thing for each one of us. Like, our stress and worries are completely different than the person sitting beside us. I tell Chad all the time, like, even our stress and worries are completely different as a married couple. Like, do we pray about those together? 100%. But the way that we stress and worry about different things is completely different. And I think it's the same thing about debts. Like, God doesn't prevent us from stressing and worrying in life. Like, when we have debts, when we have things going great, like, I think even when things are going great, sometimes in the back of your mind, like, you still have that worry of when's the shoe going to drop? Like, when is the bad going to come? Because God tells us to prepare for those things. He tells us to pray about those things because He has told us that it's not going to be perfect forever. Like, He tells us that, like, things are going to happen. You're going to have to be challenged. The devil surrounds us every single day. He tries to enter into our lives. And so we know that that's going to happen. And that's kind of where it comes into having to develop that foundational discipleship to be able to encourage us to be closer to God. And I always think about, so I didn't grow up in the Baptist church. So I went through a lot of, like, I wouldn't say changes, but the way that we did a lot of our worship and stuff was completely different than what we do now, or what I do now. And not saying that's right or wrong, but it did provide a different, I don't want to say different, it provided a foundational faith, but I feel like as I've moved into the Baptist church, I do a lot more like Bible study and investment because I feel a lot more moved in my faith to be able to do that. And I learned a lot when I was in elementary school and middle school and high school, but I really do feel like my fellowship, like true fellowship with God, really became as I got older because I kind of learned that life happens, and the more time that you spend in the Bible, like, you get that. And for me, I grew up in a church where, every Sunday it was like the standard, like, you did an Old Testament verse, you did a New Testament verse, you did a gospel, you said the same prayers, you did communion, and you went through the motions. And I think a lot of times when we get into that habit, sometimes we get comfortable in habits, and I think that's kind of where I got when I got into high school, is I was just comfortable in the habit. Like, I would go to church on Sunday, say the Lord's Prayer, everything was good, like, moving on. And I think now as I've gotten older, I've spent more time really kind of Bible studying, digesting, devotions, like little Bible verses in a planner, like just to kind of reiterate that. I always say, like, your war repertoire, like, so that you're ready for battle whenever it comes. Because I do think ultimately, like, that's what God tells us to treasure in life, is to treasure His word and to treasure Him being with us. Like, that's one of the biggest things. Like, even when we think about our relationships, God should always be at the center of that. He should always be first. He should really be priority over significant others, children, etc. Because if you don't have that strong foundation with Him, and you don't have that treasured love with Him, it's hard to also expand that treasured love and gifts to those around you. And so today we're going to talk about kind of that warning that Jesus gives in His sermon to the people that, hey, FYI, like, we need to be mindful of what we're treasuring. And I think it's important for us to really, as we're going through this, think about how do we decide what's valuable in our life. I think as we get older, it becomes a little bit easier to think about our values. But sometimes we have some shifts and some changes and things of that. But today we're going to start with Matthew 6:19 through 24. Don't store up yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light within your darkness, how deep is that darkness? No one can serve two masters, since either will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and desire the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And so basically, in this moment, Jesus is giving this message of you have worldly possessions and you have spiritual possessions. And you have to figure out which one is going to be where you invest like your money at. Like, it's great, beautiful. You have all these things down here that everybody can see, but what does that prepare you for up top? And I think even in here, he says, like, earthly treasures are subject to loss. Like, they're gonna rust. Anything metal is gonna rust. Like, the more stuff you have, the more tempting it makes somebody to want to come and steal it. Like, it makes people jealous and envy. When I read the part about like the moth destroys, all I could think about is like somebody like grandma's house with mothballs like in the attic, and that's all you can smell, because they have like all these things that they put mothballs in there so like the moths wouldn't get into them, but they just kept them, and they'd just been in the attic for years because it was something that was of treasure to them. That was kind of what it made me like think of when I was reading it. But I think it's like very important for us to feel like, or to think about what's going to be of value to us. Like, everything that's here on the earth is a fleeting value. It could be a fleeting value tomorrow, it could be a fleeting value whenever, but the spiritual things that we value hold that eternal value that we're ultimately trying to achieve. Like, we want to be able to get to heaven. And it says here, like, no one can serve two masters. Like, we can't be all about money here and also have that true commitment and relationship with God that he tells us, because our heart's going to be devoted to one or the other. So if we're spending money on God, like, that is us being devoted to God. But if we're spending money on us and making sure that we're happy here on earth and all those things, like, we aren't spending what we need to in our relationship with God, because we can't possess 100% our relationship and values with God the same way that we can possess our relationship with things here on earth, because they're at war, they're at battle. And I think that a lot of times the Bible talks about wealth a lot. Like, it's, I think even in the world that we live in today, like, wealth is one of those things that is constantly on people's mind. Like, how are we going to pay this? What are we going to do about this? We should do this. Like, money is a driving force in the world we live in. And the Bible talks about it even before today when we were living and all the other things that are in existence. But even if we're investing in things, those earthly things should be used for God's purpose. Like, God doesn't tell us to not buy things. He's just telling us or reminding us that when we invest in something, like, we need to be using it as a ministry for him. It's not just for us to be able to have that. Like, we don't want to be pursuing earthly things and not focusing on what our future holds, because what we treasure defines the direction of our heart. Like, our heart is either going towards God or pulling away from God. And the more time that we spend being generous with our heart, like, we're providing that light of God. Like, we are being a beacon, whether that is, giving or anything that. But the more that we have a selfish heart, the more darkness that brings into our life, because the more selfish we have, the more we open ourselves up to the devil being able to come in and influence us. And wealth and possessions can become masters of us if we're not careful. Like, we can spend all of our time then become consumed by money and all the things. And I think a lot of times when you think about people who have lots of money, probably shouldn't generalize, but when I think about like celebrities, I think a lot of times they become so invested in that wealth aspect that we don't see them standing up and telling everybody about their love and relationship with God and Jesus. If nothing else, we see them almost promoting a life without that, and they have all this wealth and possession. And I think the sad reality is sometimes it draws people in to have those false idols, like especially younger generations. Like they see them with this money and this possession, but we would rather have them be influenced by people who use that money and wealth for positive things. And I think that's like, unfortunately, kind of the world we live in, is people are either like all about their possessions or they're about the relationship with God. And God tells us, even in the Bible, like we need to make sure that we are focusing our hearts and treasuring our hearts on what is important, and he tells us that is our relationship with him. So we'll move into Matthew 6:25, and we have to think about like, how do we decide what's valuable to us, but we also have to think about like what kind of things are tempted to us, or even things that we worry about. So as we look into this, at 25, it says, "Therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body or what you will wear. Isn't life more than food, and the body more than the clothing? Consider the birds of the sky. They don't sow or reap or gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you worth more than they? Can any of you add 1 moment to his lifespan by worrying? And why do you worry about clothes? Observe how the wildflowers of the fields grow. They don't labor or spin thread. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was adorned like one of these. That's how God's clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and thrown into the furnace tomorrow. Why won't he do much more for you, you of little faith?" So I think very first sentence there, "Therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life." And that's the most important part that Jesus tells us here in this whole thing. Therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life. Fun fact, we're going to worry about our life, right? It doesn't but God, or Jesus tells us in this, he takes care of the flowers, he takes care of the birds. They're just living their best life. They're just sitting there in the grass, the birds are just flying around, they don't have a worry in the world. And Jesus tells us, why are we not like them? Think about how they are. God provides for them, so it's a reminder that he's going to provide for you. And I think a lot of times this is kind of where we get into those, what we treasure. We get into a point where it's okay, well, he tells us, what will you eat? What will you drink? What will you wear? A lot of times those are the things that we start investing our money in. Oh, we want to go eat something nice. Oh, I want a new outfit. Oh, I want to do X, Y, and Z. But we know that in the end, those are the necessities that God's going to provide for us. And I think that's a reminder that, we can stockpile all these things and we can start treasuring all these things, but we're kind of warned against that in the Bible. He tells us, we need to be mindful of what life's necessities are. And he's not necessarily telling us that we can't have extra, but he's also reminding us that we need to be mindful of where we're investing that extra in. What are we treasuring when we're investing those extras in? Because life is going to have its struggles, no matter if you have a lot of money or you have no money. And so we're never going to avoid anxiety or worry. But if we think about just our basic daily needs, we don't have to stress about that because we know that's what God's going to provide. But when we start investing in other things, those daily needs are going to be the things that we kind of are really start worrying about, because we've invested in so many other things that we are oh, I can't, got to go buy some ham because things are getting tight at the end of the month, all of the things. And so I think that when we start worrying about those things, that puts our doubt in God. Because God tells us, I'm going to provide those things. I'm going to provide the necessities for you. I'm going to make things happen. I have the ability to provide. I'm willing to provide. You just have to trust that that will happen. And I think it's very important for us that we have to replace all that worry that we have with trust. And as we go into the new year, I think that was kind of one of a lot of people pick a new word. I think that my word for this year that I kind of want to invest in is trust, because I do think it's very important to have that trust in God, that things are he's going to guide you in the path that you are, that you're going to trust the process and all that. Because a lot of times we do get built into the worry of everyday life. And so I think it's important to be mindful that God has created us, and he's created us in an image that he truly adores and loves, and he cares for all of his things. But Jesus tells us in this, like, hey, FYI, like, he cares for the birds and the flowers. He takes care of them. You're much more worth than the birds and the flowers, don't you think? Like, he tells us that. And so don't you think that if you're worth more, that he's going to give what he has promised to you? And it's trusting that we know that that's going to happen. And I think a lot of times, like, we forget to trust that that process is going to happen because we get so bogged down and worried in the worldly treasures that are around us that we feel like are consuming everything we have, that debt that we owe, the things that we need, all the stuff. But ultimately, God has met our needs in our lives more times than we can ever imagine. And sometimes we need to be minded of that time where God met your need when you needed him most, and think about that and how that made you feel and how that brought you closer to trusting that he was going to make that decision. Instead of being in the moments of worry, like, we need to focus more on what is going to happen, because we don't want to lose what we have today worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow. I saw a quote one time that talked about, like, we know tomorrow's going to also have problems, so, like, why are we worrying about tomorrow's problems when we can focus on today's problems? Because today is here. Like, you don't want to waste the seconds and minutes that you were blessed with today worrying about tomorrow. And you don't want to spend the seconds and minutes today worrying about something that happened yesterday, because you can't go back and change it. So I think it's very important that when we think about those possessions and the things that we worry about, trusting that God has given us today and tomorrow will be tomorrow, and not stressing about as much tomorrow, and trusting that today will be the day that God is with us and guiding us. And I think about sometimes as a person, when we think about, you know, a lot of times bad things stick out a lot more because it causes us more stress and anxiety. But if we were to think about all the good things that happen each day, there's usually something good that happens every single day. But a lot of times we get hung up in the bad. And I think it's important for us, like, as we're into this new year, like, the more that we can focus on those good things, like, the better we are. And I'm starting to giggle here because I think about, like, those videos where people fall. Chad gets really mad because I'll start, like, busting out laughing because I'll get stuck on watching videos of people, like, falling. And I think about it because we're drawn to, unfortunately, in the world that we live in, we're more drawn to hearing about bad things and not celebrating good things. And I think in the new year, that's one thing, I know in the new year, that's one thing that I really want to trust in God, is focusing more on the good. So when I say, like, my word is trust, like, there's a lot of things in, like, that I've thought about to be able to focus on that relationship with him, but also the positivity that can be in life, because we know stress is going to happen, we know worry is going to happen, but it's trusting in him to know that everything will work out the way that it's supposed to be. So we'll look at Matthew 6:31 through 34. So don't worry, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Because it's true. Each day does have its own trouble as its own. And it's important for us to think about, like, how much are we going to focus on that bad? You know, you could be driving to work in the morning, unless you're retired, and one day I'll be there. But you're driving to work in the morning, and somebody makes you mad just on your drive to work, and then you just get hung up on it, and you can't let it go. They're not worried about you, so why are we worrying about them? And I think it's important that God tells us, like, that's going to take away your today. Like, it's going to take away your tomorrow. Like, you're going to still go to work tomorrow, even though you had a bad day today. So the same thing could happen tomorrow, but there's no need to let that take away from that experience. Because when we have that relationship with God and we believe in that relationship with God, we don't have to seek the hope in the material things, because we are blessed by God. We don't have to settle for the temptations and the emptiness of the substitutes of worldly possessions, because we have a glorious end that's coming. And Jesus is teaching us in this last verse right here that we kind of talked about, is that you need to seek God first, no matter what. Like, you should always seek God first. And I think a lot of times when we're stressed and worried, we think about what we can do for that. Like, what can I do to fix this problem? And we need to take the time and reverse that and say, dear God, this is my problems, or this is what I'm worrying about. I trust that you're going to take care of it. As simple as that. Dear God, this is what I'm worrying about, and I trust that you're going to take care of it. Now, it's really hard to reprogram the brain to want to think that way, right? But I think it's very important for us as people that we need to get more in the habit of saying, God, I'm worrying, but I trust that you're going to take care of it. Because I think it will bring us more inner peace because we're seeking God first. And we know that God is going to give us the peace in whatever decision he makes, because it's the path that he has laid out for us. It's the plan he has given us. He tells us in Jeremiah 29:11, like, I have a plan for you. Like, he knows what's going to happen. He knows what we're going to do. He knows those days that we're going to doubt. He knows those days we're going to worry. But he has a plan for us, and he tries to guide us on that plan as much as possible. And so I think some of that time is to be mindful of, hey, God, like, I have a worry, but I trust you're going to take care of it. Because a lot of times we're going to become preoccupied with all the other things and miss out on all the grace and goodness and power that God is bestowing on us in those days of today, not tomorrow, in those days of today, because we're so focused and worried about what tomorrow brings. And we don't want to lose what we have today, because our earthly life here is short. We want to make the most of it to be able to do what God has bestowed upon us to be able to do, and to be disciples of that, to be able to spread his word, to be able to share his message, so that more people can see and seek and feel what we feel with our relationship to God. That doesn't mean that we're not going to still be tempted, because the sin is all around us. That doesn't mean that we're not going to still worry, but each day has its own enough trouble on its own that we don't need to stress about any other days of trouble. Instead, we need to focus on our daily exercise with God, spending that time with him, creating that bank of tools and equipment and everything that we're going to need to be able to fight when somebody tries to make our trust be in doubt, because we're going to be in situations where we're going to need to entrust in God. We know that. That's going to happen daily, could happen monthly. He tells us to be prepared always, because we want to be followers of Christ. And in that following of Christ, we have to be eager to seek God, to be able to know that he's going to provide for us and all that. And I think about people who, just one day say, I'm going to sell everything I have, and I'm just going to go and live. And they trust that that's going to happen. And, more power to them. More power to them. I don't want to say that I don't trust that it's not going to happen, but definitely not going to be me for sure. But I think it's very important to know that God does trust us and puts trust to be able to help us. And I think that, when I said that my devotion last night kind of correlated, it went back to talking about when he was trying to tell the Sodom people to get out of Sodom, and he basically was helping, or Lot and his wife were like leaving, and then Lot's wife looked back and she turned him into a pillar of salt. And so I was like, unfortunately, no matter how much we try and guide people to being mindful of God, there's going to always be that temptation of people to look back on what has been around us. And there's going to be temptations in our lives where we're going to feel like, oh, we should, like, things were good when I was doing that, and it's going to be tempting, but we don't realize, how not good or good those things were in that time. And I think it's important to be mindful that we are in a place where we can be grateful for what we have, and to be grateful for what we have, because God has told us that changing our priorities will change our happiness. It will change our worry. It'll change our cares, because we know that when we quit worrying about what's happening here on earth and we just see the end goal of heaven, and that's all we're genuinely focused on, the world's going to still continue to happen around us when we're gone. And I think about, when people tell you that, when you work at a job, you give your all to your job. Chad will tell you that sometimes I'm really bad about that. Like, at the end of the day, you're replaceable. But I think it's remindful to us that we're not replaceable in God's eye, so it's important for us to spend our time in being dedicated in our relationship with God, because he sees us as one super important individual, just like he tells us in Psalm 139, fearfully and wonderfully made, marvelous are thy works, because each one of us are made in his image and made in his eye, and he wants each one of us to be mindful that we are of him, in an image of him, and we're here to be able to spread the message of him, because that is the priority he has for us. Anything to contribute, input, add?
Satan's real good at making people think that we have to live up to another person's standard, and people live their whole life trying to get caught up in that, not careful. So you invest in all these things, whether it's money or other things that seem important. Age has a way of teaching you that it's not so important anymore. And the older you get, the more you live, you're like, wait a minute, I'm just spinning wheels, and I'm not ever going to get to that, whatever that level is.
Yep.
So you start realizing I'm better off putting my investment in something that's 100% guaranteed.
Yep.
So,
And I think that's one thing that's like really nice about like our church is I think about just the if you hear the testimonies of some of the people in our church and how many times like they could like things could have gone completely different had they just doubted God even for a minute. But they didn't. Like, they still continued to trust that, and they continued to still invest in God. Like, I think that's a lot of testimony about that, and I think that's a lot of times for us as people. Like, sometimes that's the testimony that we leave behind that people don't always realize of that investment and where we're spending those treasures and those type things, because I think that ultimately, like, people see us and they see what we do, they see our actions, and that in turn creates this image. And I think a lot of times that's a battle that Christianity has, is when you have people who are in the church one Sunday and then on Monday they're doing something completely different, or the Saturday night before they're doing something completely different. Like, it makes people doubt like all those things, and ultimately like that's basically what this whole message is here is to tell us, is that we have to be mindful of what we're treasuring and what we're valuing and the actions that we're doing, because that is the image that we're creating for God. That's the story, that's the testimony that we're giving for God, and we want to pull people towards him, not push people away from him because they see something or actions or things that we're saying one thing and doing another.
You mentioned choosing a word, just a word for the coming year, and someone shared with me over the holidays that they had decided to choose joy, and it reminded them of the song. You might be too young, but we used to sing a little song, Jesus, others, and you, what a wonderful way to spell joy. And that the Lord had recently shared with her that she needed to remember Jesus is over me. She said, and we can share with others, Jesus is over you. He's watching over you, especially if it's a brother or sister in Christ, or someone who's struggling. It's a door that's open, using that one little word to share what he's done for us.
For sure. Write that one down. I'm going to go straight. All right. Anything else? Shane, do you mind praying for us as we close out?
Father God, we thank you for this day that you give to us to be in your house each Sunday. Is so special to us. We look forward to being able to come visit you in your house and worship each week. And we look forward to studying your word. We thank you for each person in our church that puts in the time to study and prepare and to explain scripture that we read before.